The retired canine wouldn't move until the boy spoke a word he'd never said before. The winters in Cedar Hollow are long, but this one felt endless. For 2 years, Jonas Ward lived with silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the heavy, unspoken kind that settles over a house like dust on untouched shelves. His son, Theo, hadn't said a word since the accident. Not one. Not to him, not to anyone. Then came Murphy. The dog was old, partially paralyzed. A retired German Shepherd canine no one wanted anymore. Too broken, too costly, too complicated. Jonas hadn't planned to bring him home. He just couldn't leave him behind. The moment they stepped into the house, something shifted, not in a dramatic way, just a pause in the silence. An ear that twitched, a boy who blinked. But no one expected what happened next when Theo finally whispered a word that unlocked not only Murphy's story, but the truth about a secret file, a forgotten mission, and a dog whose final purpose wasn't war, it was this boy. And that was only the beginning. Winter arrived early in Cedar Hollow that year, though no one dared say it aloud, as if naming it would give the cold more power, more permanence. Snow didn't fall, it settled, quietly, heavily, the kind that swallowed tire tracks before they could harden, and hushed footsteps before they could echo. Roofs bowed under white weight, and trees stood still as if listening for something that had long since left. The town itself was modest. No stoplights, just a blinking yellow at Main and Evergreen. There was a diner with fogged windows, and a gas station that played old country music through tinny speakers, even in storms. Everyone waved, even if they hadn't spoken in years. That was the kind of place Cedar Hollow was. Familiar in its silences, predictable in its pain. But at the very edge of town, past the last working street lamp, and through a tunnel of frost-tipped pine, stood the Whitaker house. A craftsman-style home with chipping white paint and a front porch that hadn't seen Christmas lights in 2 years. The driveway was always shoveled, the porch steps always salted, but no decorations, no signs of the season, no welcome, just survival, cold and careful. Inside, time didn't move, it lingered. Sheriff Jonas Whitaker, 42, moved through his morning like a man made of hinges and memories. He brewed his coffee without tasting it. He opened the curtains just wide enough to let in the gray. He placed 2 bowls on the table, one full, one untouched, and left them there until the room no longer smelled of toast or bacon, only silence. He still wore his badge, still clocked in at the precinct. He was respected, stern, composed, reliable. The kind of lawman a small town needed. Chair, beside a photo that hadn't been dusted in months. Grace and Maya, his wife and daughter, framed in golden light on the porch, barefoot and laughing, summer wind in their hair. Taken the day before everything broke. The accident was 2 years ago, and people had stopped bringing casseroles after 6 months. The grief counselors came and went. The world moved on like it always does, like it has to. But inside this house, winter never left. Upstairs, the hallway was a gallery of paused moments. Drawings in crayon, a growth chart on the doorframe, a lone pink shoe on the windowsill where Maya once fed birds. Jonas didn't touch any of it. Couldn't. Even the dust felt sacred. Down the hall, behind a door with a faded sticker that read, Theo's room, lived a boy who hadn't spoken in 729 days. Theo Whitaker, now 7, had survived the crash. A backseat miracle, they'd called him. No internal bleeding, no broken bones. Just a small boy pulled from twisted metal, wide-eyed and silent. He hadn't cried when they told him his mother and sister were gone. Hadn't screamed, hadn't asked why. He had simply stopped being. Jonas didn't understand trauma the way doctors did. He didn't have the language for it, but he knew the look in Theo's eyes, like he was falling in slow motion, and no one could catch him. Some days he wondered if his son blamed him. Other days, he wondered if Theo remembered any of it at all. Which was worse? He didn't know. There were no bedtime stories anymore, no goodnight kisses, no arguments about vegetables, just routines. Jonas would knock twice, open the door, leave clean clothes on the edge of the bed, and retreat. Sometimes Theo dressed, sometimes he didn't, but he always sat at the window, forehead resting on the frosted glass, watching something no one else could see. They moved around each other like strangers sharing a space built for laughter. Meals were silent. Nights were longer than they should be. And the fire, when it burned, felt like it was pretending. Jonas tried, in his own way. He had bought books on trauma, tried sign language, hired therapists who came once a week and left with sad eyes and tighter folders. Nothing reached Theo. Not touch, not words, not time. That morning was no different. Jonas poured lukewarm coffee into a chipped mug and sat across from his son, who stared at his plate without blinking. The house creaked around them, the sound of old bones in winter. A clock ticked. Somewhere outside, a bird called once, then went quiet. Snow's getting bad. Plates. Theo had eaten 2 bites of toast. It was more than yesterday. Progress, maybe. He stood by the sink, staring out the window as flurries thickened into a storm. The snow danced sideways now, driven by a wind that moaned low through the valley like something lost and lonely. Behind him the house groaned, the kind of sound that made him pause. There was no music in this home, no laughter, no sound that wasn't functional. Every noise was either necessary or accidental. Nothing lived here, not really, just 2 people orbiting absence. And in the middle of it a dog bowl still tucked beneath the pantry, untouched since their golden retriever, Molly, passed 6 months after Grace. Jonas hadn't had the heart to throw it away. He didn't believe in signs, not anymore. But that afternoon, as the sun disappeared before 4 and the wind picked up speed, something shifted, just slightly. As if the house, or maybe the world, was holding its breath. And out on the edge of the snow-smeared backyard, just before dusk, something moved. The window in Theo's room was narrow, old, and a little warped at the edges where the frost crept in. But every morning, long before the sky turned fully gray, that's where he sat, knees drawn to his chest, cheek pressed to the cold pane, eyes fixed on the falling snow. He never opened the curtains fully, just enough to see the outside without being seen. He didn't move much, didn't flinch when the wind howled, didn't blink when the trees swayed like ghosts. Just stared, like he was waiting for something. Jonas had stopped asking what. 2 years had passed since the crash, 2 birthdays, 2 Halloweens, 2 Christmases, where the living room stayed dark and the tree never made it down from the attic, and in all that time, Theo hadn't spoken a single word. The silence wasn't angry, it wasn't dramatic, it wasn't even resistant, it was still. As if the boy had folded himself inward, tucked his voice in a place no one could reach. Even grief had been quiet with Theo. He didn't scream at the funeral, didn't sob into his father's chest. He stood between pews with a small blue tie choking his throat, his hands clenched at his sides, his eyes fixed on the caskets. When people knelt to whisper condolences, he didn't look away. He didn't look at them either. He simply wasn't there. Jonas had once tried to explain Theo's condition to a social worker from out of town. It's like living with a candle that still burns, he'd said, but won't give off light anymore. She had nodded like she understood, but he could tell she didn't. Most people didn't. Theo didn't go to school anymore, not since the 3rd therapist had called it unproductive. He didn't play video games or draw like he used to. The crayons were still in the bottom drawer, untouched. The coloring book with Maya's half-finished unicorn still lay open on page 17. Dust had settled in the creases. The boy moved through the house like water through a pipe, always in patterns, always at the same times. He would appear at breakfast, dressed or not, eat or not, then disappear. Sometimes to the old recliner in the living room, sometimes to the small closet off the hallway where he once played hide-and-seek. Now it was more of a cave, a shell. And yet, Despite the silence, Jonas knew his son was still there, still watching. He'd catch glimpses of him from the corner of his eye, curled on the couch with one sock half off, tracing his fingers along the frayed edge of a cushion, or lying on the hallway floor, eyes closed, listening to something only he could hear. He never reached for his father, never looked him in the eye. But he didn't flinch either, and to Jonas, that absence of fear felt like a kind of miracle. Some nights, Jonas would stand outside Theo's door, long after the house had gone dark. He'd listen for breathing. Sometimes it was shallow, sometimes it hitched, like Theo was caught between sleep and something else. On harder nights, Jonas would sit on the floor outside the door, head resting against the wall, a cup of coffee cooling in his hand, whispering stories no one answered. One night he read from an old picture book Maya used to love, the one about a bear who wandered too far from home. His voice cracked on page 5. By page 6 he was crying into the silence. Theo never opened the door. Still, Jonas read it again the next night, just in case. The house learned to bend around Theo's silence. It learned not to expect sounds of footsteps on the stairs, not to wait for the hum of a toy car across the hardwood. Jonas stopped turning on the TV, stopped leaving the radio on in the kitchen. It felt wrong somehow, as if noise was a betrayal. Instead, he cleaned, quietly. He kept things just tidy enough to show love, but never enough to erase. Grace's slippers still sat beneath the bed. Maya's pink coat still hung on the hallway hook. And Theo's drawings, taped to the inside of the pantry door, remained untouched. Even the one with a stick figure family, all smiling, standing in front of what used to be the lake. Jonas couldn't throw them away, not because he was clinging to the past, but because they were the last proof that joy had once lived here, that laughter had once echoed down these walls like wind chimes, that once, long ago, a little boy with sandy hair had tugged his sister's braid and shouted, "Daddy," when Jonas came through the door. He would have given anything to hear that again. But now, Theo didn't call out, didn't ask for water at night, didn't run to the flinched and stopped coming downstairs for 3 days. They rehomed the dog quietly. The bowl stayed in the pantry. Hope, like most things in the Whitaker house, had a short shelf life. Until that night. The snow came harder than usual. Jonas had returned home late from a minor accident report, fender bender on the county road. Nothing serious, but visibility was poor. Wind carried flakes like tiny needles, and drifts were forming faster than plows could cut through. He parked the patrol truck and stepped inside, stomping snow from his boots. And there, by the window again, was Theo. Same spot, same posture. But something in the way his head tilted, something made Jonas stop. The boy's breath had fogged the glass, but his hand was lifted now, pressing gently against the pane. Not just watching, not this time, listening. Outside, buried deep beneath the fence line, barely visible in the moon-washed snow, was something dark, something not moving. Jonas squinted. It wasn't there earlier. He stepped closer. Theo didn't look at him, but his hand tapped the window once, deliberate, small, urgent. Something was out there, and Theo had noticed. The wind that night had teeth. It howled low through the pine trees behind the Whitaker house, curling around trunks like something ancient and angry. Snow came in sideways, biting and sharp, carving small dunes against fence posts and window ledges. It wasn't the kind of storm that startled. It was the kind that seeped, quiet, patient, a burial more than a blizzard. Inside the house, the heat clicked on with a metallic sigh. Jonas was asleep on the couch, half-dressed in his uniform, one boot still on. A half-read report lay across his chest, his arm draped over it like a father holding onto fading responsibilities. The fire in the hearth had burned down to a whisper. Shadows stretched long and thin across the floor. Upstairs, Theo stood barefoot at the window, his fingers pressed to the frost-rimmed glass. He had seen it move, just once, a flicker, barely perceptible, but now it lay still. A dark shape hunched near the back fence, tangled in snow and thorns, just at the edge of visibility. Not quite shadow, not quite living. Theo didn't think, he moved. The hallway was cold underfoot. The stairs creaked once, just enough to make him pause, but the storm covered his steps like a blanket. He passed the kitchen in silence. The fridge buzzed. The old clock above the sink ticked softly. Somewhere beneath the floorboards, the house exhaled. He opened the front door. The night met him with a slap of wind, icy, unfiltered. It sucked the breath from his lungs, burned, hadn't moved. Theo's eyes locked onto it. His breath came in sharp bursts, fogging the air in front of him. Still, no sound, no cry, no call. Just stillness. He crossed the threshold. The snow swallowed his ankles with the first step. It was deeper than it looked, soft on top, crusted beneath. He felt the sting immediately, but his face remained calm. He didn't rush, didn't hesitate. He walked like the cold didn't matter, like pain was familiar, like it wasn't worse than what already lived inside him. Halfway across the yard, the wind shifted. The trees behind him moaned, and flakes whipped against his cheeks. He blinked them away. Ahead of him, the dark shape began to take form. A dog. Larger than expected. German shepherd, probably. Its coat was thick, but filthy, clumped with frost. One leg was tucked beneath its body, unnaturally. The rear half looked wrong, twisted, sunken into the snow like it no longer knew how to belong. Its ears were pinned back, its muzzle coated in slush, but the eyes, God. The eyes. Amber, faintly lit, wide open. They didn't plead. They didn't flinch. They didn't blink, they just watched. Theo stopped 2 feet away. Neither moved. The boy's hair was wet now, sticking to his forehead. His lips were chapped and trembling, but he stood there, gazing down at this broken creature, and in that moment, the storm seemed to pause around them, as if even the wind was waiting to see what would happen next. Theo knelt slowly, his knees sinking into the snow with a muffled crunch. The dog didn't growl, didn't twitch. It simply breathed, barely. Theo unwrapped the blanket from his shoulders. It was blue, thick, frayed along one edge, one of Grace's. Jonas had folded it once and left it at the end of Theo's bed, long ago, hoping it would offer comfort. Theo had never used it, until now. With careful hands he draped the blanket over the dog, not haphazardly, not like a child covering a stuffed animal, but gently, like he knew this moment mattered. The fabric settled over the dog's back, melting snow on contact. And still, no movement. But Theo saw it. A flicker. The ear twitched. He stayed there for another minute, maybe longer. His small hand hovered near the dog's shoulder, uncertain. He didn't pet it. He didn't touch its face. He just let his presence be felt. And in the cold silence, a warmth began to grow, not physical, not immediate, but real. Something had shifted. Theo stood. His legs trembled. He turned back to walk. Too quiet. Then he noticed the front door wasn't fully latched.
Just as official listeners have found. Something plangs.
Just barely ajar. A sliver of wind whispering through the gap. He rose quickly, heart skipping, and opened it wide. The porch was empty. His eyes scanned the yard, and that's when he saw it. A mound in the snow, near the fence line, now covered in a blanket, and beside it, 2 small footprints, leading home. Jonas didn't remember throwing on his coat. One moment he was staring at the blanket-covered shape in the snow. The next, he was knee-deep in it, boots crunching with urgency, flashlight beams swaying in the wind like a nervous heartbeat. The storm hadn't let up. If anything, it had thickened, as though it were trying to bury what the boy had uncovered. The German shepherd lay motionless, snow clinging to its fur like ash. The blanket Theo had placed was already crusted with ice along the edges, but its center was still warm, just barely. Jonas crouched, hand trembling as he reached for the animal's muzzle. Breath, faint, shallow, but real. He swept the light across the body. Muddy fur, torn paw pads, legs bent wrong. The rear half was limp, twisted, unnaturally, as if it had been that way for some time. There was no blood, but the smell of pain hung in the air. A scent you didn't forget once you'd smelled it enough. "Easy, buddy," Jonas whispered. His voice cracked from the cold and something older. "I've got you." The dog didn't growl, didn't flinch. His eyes opened slowly, liquid amber, dulled by exhaustion, rimmed with frost, and yet not afraid, not pleading, just watching like he'd seen this before. Jonas slipped his arms under the dog's body, one beneath the front legs, the other under the ribs. The weight startled him. The dog was big, dense with muscle once, but now wasted. His coat was filthy, thick in some places, matted in others. Jonas felt bones, scar tissue, something hard near the spine. He stood slowly, the dog cradled against his chest, the blue blanket wrapped around them both like a makeshift shroud. The dog didn't resist, didn't even shiver. He simply let himself be carried. By the time Jonas stepped back onto the porch, snow had crusted his shoulders, his breath rising in thick plumes. The door creaked open under his foot. Warmth and light met them like a hush. He carried the dog straight to the living room, to the hearth, where the fire had dwindled to red coals. He gently laid the animal down on the old braided rug, the one Grace used to clean every Saturday morning, the one Maya used to pretend was a magic flying circle. Jonas knelt beside the dog and touched the flank. Cold. Too cold, but not beyond saving. He got to work, fresh wood on the fire, a pot of water warming on the stove, a worn towel retrieved from the linen closet upstairs. He moved with quiet precision, like someone handling evidence or memory, every motion deliberate, not unconscious, just surrendered. Jonas returned with the towel and knelt again, gently patting down the dog's face, paws, and flanks. He avoided the rear legs. They lay awkwardly, unmoving, the toes splayed like dead branches. Jonas didn't need a vet to tell him something was wrong. This wasn't a recent injury. It had been lived in. "You've been carrying this a long time, haven't you?" he muttered. The dog blinked slowly, as if in answer. Jonas ran a hand along the animal's ribcage. Scarred, scar tissue thick and raised in places, a mess of damage beneath the fur. His fingers brushed something strange just above the belly, an irregular patch. Shaved once, a jagged line, surgical, crude. He paused. There was a story here, one that hadn't been told in a long time. Jonas sat back on his heels. The fire crackled now, painting flickers of gold across the walls. The dog's eyes reflected it faintly, alive, but distant. Theo stood at the edge of the hallway, silent, wrapped in his blanket again, watching. He didn't come closer, just stared, not at the dog, but at his father. Jonas nodded toward the dog. "He needs a name." Theo said nothing. Jonas glanced back at the shepherd. Something about the way the dog lay there, too still, too quiet, reminded him of old partners, the ones who kept their pain deep, who didn't bark, didn't bite, but simply endured, ghosts in fur and uniform. "Murphy," he said softly, "you look like a Murphy." The dog blinked again, and that was enough. From then on, the name stayed. Jonas brought a shallow bowl of water, warmed just enough to tempt. Murphy didn't lap at it, only sniffed once before resting his muzzle back on the rug. Jonas didn't push. He just sat, one hand resting on the dog's shoulder, feeling the slight rise and fall of his breathing. In the corner, Theo slid down the wall and curled into himself on the floor, still watching. Minutes passed, then an hour. Outside, the wind roared, shaking the windows in their frames. But inside, in that fire-warmed room, something had shifted. The house no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like something was waiting to live again, and all it had taken was a boy's blanket and a dying dog with no name, now breathing under firelight, now called Murphy. The fire had burned low again by the time Jonas finished clearing the kitchen. He hadn't eaten much. A reheated can of chili, dry cornbread. His appetite had gone the same way as laughter, out the back door, somewhere behind the grief and closed blinds. He rinsed his mug, turned off the light over the sink, and lingered in the hush that followed. The silence was heavier now, but different. Not dead weight, not that cold, echoing absence that had hung in the house like hadn't moved. Still curled near the hearth, eyes half shut, his breathing steady but shallow. And then Jonas saw him. Theo. The boy had come without sound, as he always did. His blanket was wrapped loosely around his shoulders, dragging at the corners. His small feet, bare again, barely disturbed the rug as he stepped forward. His eyes didn't look at Jonas. They didn't scan the room. They were locked on Murphy. Soft, curious, steady. Jonas didn't speak. He barely breathed. He watched as Theo reached the edge of the rug and knelt beside the dog, the blanket sliding off one shoulder. The boy's fingers, still pale from the cold earlier, reached down, not to pet, not to test, but to cover. He took the edge of his own blanket and, without a word, without instruction, gently draped it across Murphy's back. Not over the head, not over the paws, just the back, just enough. Murphy didn't stir, but one ear twitched, barely a flick. Jonas stood in the shadowed doorway, his hand resting against the frame, like he needed it to stay upright. He felt something in his chest tighten, sharp and sudden. A breath that caught, a memory that didn't ask permission. It had been 729 nights since he'd seen Theo reach for something that wasn't his own silence. 729 days since his son had spoken, touched, chosen, moved with intention. And now here he was, kneeling beside a broken dog, choosing to offer warmth. Jonas felt his throat close. He blinked hard. He couldn't remember the last time he cried in front of anyone, not since the service, not since the caskets. But standing there, watching his boy reach into the fragile shell of another wounded creature, it felt like the breath had been knocked from him. He didn't want to move, didn't want to break the moment. Theo adjusted the blanket slightly, smoothing the edge along Murphy's ribs. His hand lingered for a second, lightly resting, not stroking, not pressing, just there. Contact. Presence. Then he stood, slowly, not looking back. He padded back toward the hallway, stepped soft as snowfall, and disappeared into the dark. Jonas didn't follow. He stepped into the room instead and knelt where Theo had been. Murphy stirred faintly under the warmth, blinking once toward the fire, then toward Jonas. "You've done more in one night," Jonas whispered, "than I have in 2 years." Murphy closed his eyes again. The room was warm now, but like that, small kindnesses done without spectacle. Jonas walked back toward the stairs, then paused. At the end of the hall, just barely visible through the cracked door of Theo's room, he saw a shape on the windowsill. A blanket, a small silhouette. Theo, sitting cross-legged again, staring out into the dark. But this time, his back wasn't hunched. His shoulders weren't curled in. He looked upright, awake. Jonas didn't disturb him. Instead, he turned, whispered to himself, "Thank you, Murphy," and clicked the hall light off. Downstairs, the blanket stayed on the dog. The fire danced low, and in the silence between heartbeats, something in the house shifted. Not loud, not sudden, just forward. By morning, the snow had softened into silence. Outside the Whitaker home, the world was covered in white, the kind that hushed everything it touched. Fence posts wore thick crowns. The bird bath had vanished beneath a quilt of ice. Even the trees bowed their heads as if in reverence. Inside, the fire still breathed faint heat. Murphy lay where Jonas had left him, curled in the same spot near the hearth, blanketed not just in fabric, but in stillness. His chest rose and fell, with quiet rhythm. Eyes open now, more alert than the night before, but no less exhausted. Jonas sat on the floor beside him, steaming coffee in one hand, the other resting gently on the edge of the blanket that Theo had so carefully placed. He hadn't slept much, couldn't. Every time he'd closed his eyes, he saw Theo kneeling there again, so small, so silent, but finally reaching for something. That image had burrowed into him like a prayer. He didn't dare disturb it. He set the coffee mug down and exhaled long and low. Then, with quiet fingers, he peeled back the blanket. Murphy didn't resist. His ears twitched once, his eyes flicked toward Jonas, then drifted away again, unfazed. It was a trust that hadn't been earned, only offered, unspoken, unearned, fragile. Jonas reached out, pressing his palm gently against the dog's side. The fur there was thick but matted in places, tangled with dirt and remnants of ice. He moved slowly, methodically, fingers searching, not with the curiosity of a pet owner, but with the instinct of a man who had once searched people for wounds. Near the dog's flank, his hand, this was surgical. Jonas had seen scars like this before. Once on a fellow deputy who'd taken shrapnel in a meth lab raid. Another time on a rescue dog that had taken a bullet for his handler and made it out by the grace of a combat medic. Jonas sat back slowly, eyes narrowing. "You're not just some stray," he murmured. Murphy didn't flinch. He just blinked once, long and slow. Jonas shifted to examine the back legs next, careful not to startle. They were limp, lifeless from the hips down. One foot dragged slightly to the side, the paw worn raw on the bottom. The muscles had atrophied. The spine had a slight arch to it, just above the hips, an unnatural dip that made Jonas wince. Whatever had happened had been violent, and it hadn't been treated properly. Not fully. He felt his gut tighten. This wasn't a farm dog that had fallen off a porch. This was something else. Something trained, hardened, abandoned. "You were somebody's partner," Jonas said softly, "weren't you?" Murphy turned his head slightly, ears half lifted. And for a brief moment, Jonas saw it. Beneath the weariness, beneath the injury, there was a shape of something once whole. Not a pet, a professional, a soldier. Jonas leaned back against the couch, rubbing a hand over his jaw. His fingers grazed the stubble he hadn't bothered to shave. He didn't know where this dog had come from. No collar, no tags, no microchip. He had checked last night almost instinctively. Just this body, this wreckage. And yet here the animal lay, still breathing, still here. Jonas looked toward the hallway. Theo's door was closed, a soft sliver of light beneath it. He wondered if the boy was awake, if he knew what he'd found, if any part of this had been fate. He shook the thought. Fate had stopped visiting the Whitaker household a long time ago. Still, something stirred in him. He reached for the blanket and recovered Murphy gently. The dog let out a small exhale, almost a sigh. Jonas stayed seated beside him, one hand resting just above the old scar. "I don't know where you came from," he said quietly, "and I don't know who left you like this. But you're safe now. You're not going back out into that snow." Murphy's eyes fluttered shut. In the corner of the room, the fire cracked once. A log shifted. Jonas leaned his head back and closed his eyes too, just for a moment. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. And in a house long haunted by absence, that mattered. The sun hadn't quite cleared the trees yet, but Cedar Hollow had already begun to glow. It was that delicate hour, just before light turns warm, when everything outside slightly, just enough to notice. Theo padded in barefoot, shoulders swallowed by a faded hoodie several sizes too big. His hair stuck up in the back, a soft halo of sleep. He didn't turn on the lights, didn't make a sound. He moved like he didn't want to disturb the house, or maybe like he didn't want to wake whatever delicate thread was holding the morning together. He opened the refrigerator with care, its interior light casting a faint glow on his pale face. His small fingers rummaged quietly, then paused on a piece of foil. One sausage, wrapped tightly, left over from the morning before. Theo didn't hesitate. He closed the fridge, clutched the offering in his hands like something sacred, and walked barefoot through the cold kitchen floor toward the living room. The fire had long since died, but its scent lingered, embers, ash, and pine. Murphy lay in the same spot near the hearth, curled tightly into himself, eyes closed, but ears alert. His breathing was shallow but steady. The blanket still covered his back, gently rising and falling with each breath. Theo knelt beside him without a word. He unwrapped the foil, placed the sausage near the dog's bowl, not in it, but beside it, carefully, with intention. Then, as if fulfilling a quiet ceremony, he folded the foil and set it aside. And then he sat, legs crossed, back straight, facing Murphy. The two of them didn't touch, didn't speak, didn't even make eye contact. But they were together. The air between them felt different than the rest of the house. Denser, warmer, like the invisible pulse of something waking after too long a sleep. Murphy opened one eye. He saw the sausage, then saw the boy. He didn't move. Not yet. Theo didn't react either. He simply sat, small hands resting on his knees, breath slow and even. And so they waited. A full minute passed, then another. It was Murphy who moved first. He stretched his neck slowly, carefully, and sniffed the air once. His nose hovered over the sausage, but he didn't take it. Instead, he turned his head slightly to look at Theo. Just a glance, just long enough. And only then did he lean forward and take the sausage in his mouth, chewing slowly, almost respectfully. Theo blinked. A quiet satisfaction passed across his face, so soft it could have been mist. No moment, one hand on the rail, socked feet planted, unsure if he should go down or stay hidden. What he saw below didn't feel like something meant to be witnessed. His son, his silent, aching son, sitting in quiet stillness beside a crippled dog, offering part of his breakfast like a monk in prayer. Jonas didn't interrupt. He backed away gently, letting the stairs sigh beneath him. Later that morning, Jonas would walk back into the kitchen to find the foil folded on the counter, the fridge slightly ajar, and in the living room, the dog asleep again, the boy gone. But that moment, those first shared offerings between a boy and a dog, became a rhythm, a ritual. Every morning, just before sunrise, Theo would rise, open the fridge, retrieve a sausage, and bring it to Murphy's side. He would wait. Murphy wouldn't eat until the boy sat down. There was never a command, never a cue, only understanding, only time. Jonas began calling it the morning shift in his mind. He started waking up earlier just to hear the fridge open, to listen for the light creak of bare feet on wood. It became the most sacred sound in the house, not because it was loud, but because it meant something was still alive in them. Theo never spoke during these offerings, but Jonas knew words were overrated. The boy had found a language beyond them, and for the first time in years, Jonas didn't feel like he was living with a ghost. He was watching his son return to the world, one shared breath at a time. Clara Hensley never knocked twice. She never had to. The first knock was more a courtesy than a request, an announcement to the house that she was coming in, not asking permission. After all, she'd been coming to the Whitaker place long before the silence settled in, long before casseroles turned cold in untouched ovens, long before the fire stopped feeling like home. She carried a canvas bag over one shoulder, heavy with things Jonas would never admit he needed. Frozen soups in mismatched Tupperware, a small loaf of cinnamon bread wrapped in foil, a travel-size bottle of ibuprofen. She said it was for just in case, but they both knew better. When she stepped inside that morning, the smell of firewood and quiet hit her first. It was the kind of silence that had once made her ache, but today it felt different, warmer, as if something had shifted, even if the walls hadn't caught up yet. Jonas met her at the doorway, wiping his hands on a dish towel. Still freezing out there, she huffed, stomping her boots against the mat. I swear my toes are thinking about unionizing. You'll have to negotiate with my furnace, Jonas replied with a tired smile. It wasn't forced. That was new. Clara narrowed her eyes as she peeled off her coat. You look better. What's wrong? Jonas gave a quiet chuckle and gestured toward the living room. You might want to see for yourself. She followed stepping into the room with the ease of someone who knew where every creaky floorboard lived. But the moment her eyes landed near the hearth, she stopped. The dog, large, sable-coated, German shepherd, curled into himself on the braided rug, rear legs twisted unnaturally, one ear half lifted in her direction, as if acknowledging her presence but not inviting it. And just beside him, cross-legged on the floor, head tilted, one hand resting quietly on the blanket, Theo. Clara blinked. She hadn't seen the boy this close in months. She wasn't sure anyone had. Theo didn't speak, of course not, but he didn't bolt, didn't vanish into his room like he used to when visitors crossed the threshold. He simply looked at her, calm, present. Clara's heart lodged somewhere behind her ribs. "Good morning, sweetheart," she said gently, crouching slightly, but not advancing. Theo glanced at Murphy, then back at her. Then he nodded, just once. Clara pressed a hand to her chest, as if steadying the beat of something fragile. "Well, I'll be damned," she whispered. Jonas stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching it all unfold like a man seeing spring through frost-covered glass. Clara stepped forward slowly, kneeling down near the dog's side, careful not to invade too much space. She noticed the blanket first, folded neatly, edges tucked under, Theo's doing, clearly. Then she saw the scar. Her fingers paused mid-air. "Where did you find him?" she asked, not looking up. "Back fence, during the storm," Jonas said. "Theo found him, technically." Clara studied the scar more closely now. Her nurse's eyes sharpened, scanning the jagged line along Murphy's belly. Poorly healed, field-stitched. Too deliberate to be an accident. Too desperate to be veterinary. "That's a battlefield stitch if I've ever seen one," she murmured. Jonas stepped closer. "You're sure?" Clara nodded, tracing the shape just above the ribcage without touching. "Someone fought to save him, but not in a clinic. This was done fast. Maybe dirty. But whoever did it," she looked up at Jonas, "they wanted him to live." Murphy shifted slightly beneath the blanket, letting out a low exhale. Theo didn't flinch. Clara turned to look at the boy, her voice softer now. "You feeding him?" Theo looked at the water bowl beside the dog, then back to her. Another nod. She glanced up at Jonas again, her brows lifting. "That's new?" Jonas nodded. For a moment no one spoke, just the crackle of a log in the hearth and the rhythmic breathing of the shepherd between them. Clara sat back on her heels, eyes thoughtful. "This house used to hum, you know." Jonas looked down, brow furrowed. Clara continued, her voice tender. "Laughter in the kitchen, piano upstairs, that wind chime Grace insisted on, even though it never matched anything. Boy and the dog. I think it's learning again." He looked at her, unsure. Clara leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Jonas, that boy doesn't need fixing." He frowned. "Then what does he need?" She smiled, tired and knowing. "Something that doesn't ask him to be whole." Jonas glanced at Theo, still sitting beside Murphy, now tracing slow circles in the fur along his neck, not speaking, not smiling, but there, present. And for Jonas, after 2 years of navigating shadows, that was enough. Clara stood, brushing off her knees with a groan. "Now, how about that coffee?" "In the kitchen," Jonas said, still staring. Clara patted his shoulder as she passed. "You're not alone in this house anymore, you know." Jonas nodded, but he didn't move. He stayed there, standing just beyond the edge of the rug, watching his boy sit beside the dog, who had arrived with no name and too many scars. Watching something sacred happen, without ceremony, without words, just presence, just care. And for the first time in 2 years, the ghosts in the Whitaker house weren't haunting. They were listening. Jonas pulled into the driveway just after noon, his patrol truck tires crunching through the slush that had begun to melt around the edges of Cedar Hollow. The sun was out, but faint, like someone trying to smile through old grief. Icicles wept slowly from the gutters. Snow dripped from the roof in lazy rivulets. The house looked almost ordinary, but Jonas wasn't carrying groceries or paperwork this time. He stepped out, carefully lifting a box from the passenger seat. Large, awkward, wrapped in a blanket with fraying edges. The corners jutted out, where screws and harness parts refused to sit flat, and one of the wheels spun freely with a faint click. Inside the box was a second-hand canine wheelchair. It had taken 3 phone calls, a favor from Dr. Garrison, the old canine vet who still picked up on the second ring, and a long drive to the next county to pick it up from a shelter that was about to toss it. Bent, scratched, but functional. A skeleton of hope built from aluminum and straps. Jonas carried it into the house like it was made of glass. Theo was sitting on the floor again when he entered, cross-legged beside Murphy, as the dog dozed beneath the soft rhythm of the fire. The boy looked up at the sound of the door, but said nothing. His eyes flicked to the box, then back to Murphy. Jonas closed the door behind him and placed the wheelchair gently near the couch. "I brought something," he said, voice low, almost unsure. Theo didn't respond, but he didn't look away, either. That was enough. Jonas pulled the blanket back, revealing the frame, a little dusty, but clean, with wide rear wheel. Ears twitching, his gaze settled on the frame, and for a moment, Jonas wondered if the dog recognized it. Maybe not the make or model, but the idea of it. Movement. Jonas sat on the floor and began sorting through the straps. Most were intact. A few needed rethreading. One buckle was cracked, but he had a backup from an old hiking harness in the garage. He worked slowly, methodically, the way he always had when his hands needed something to do. The way he did after the accident. After the funeral. After the house went quiet. Theo didn't leave. He scooted a little closer, watching without interrupting. His hands rested on his knees, fingers flexing slightly with each adjustment Jonas made. It took over an hour to clean the frame, tighten bolts, and replace the broken strap. Jonas worked with his back aching and his knees sore, but he didn't stop, not once. Not when the screwdriver slipped. Not when one of the wheels wobbled out of alignment and had to be recentered. Because this mattered. When it was finally assembled and stable, Jonas stood and wiped his brow with the sleeve of his flannel. He looked at Murphy, then at Theo. "You want to help?" he asked softly. Theo's eyes met his for the briefest second, then dropped to the wheelchair. The boy didn't speak, but after a moment he nodded. Together they moved toward the dog. Murphy didn't flinch, didn't resist when Jonas gently rolled him onto his side, sliding the padded straps beneath his belly and chest. Theo knelt opposite, holding the harness steady as his father eased the frame over the dog's hind legs. The process was slow, careful, quiet. When the final strap was secured and the wheels gently touched the floor, Murphy remained still. Jonas knelt beside him and whispered, "All right, big guy. Let's give it a try." He slid one arm beneath Murphy's chest, the other beneath his belly, and slowly lifted him into position. The rear legs, those twisted, silent limbs, settled into the cradle of the frame. The front paws found the ground instinctively, pressing gently against the rug. Murphy stood, sort of. The frame wobbled. His front legs trembled. But he was upright, more than he'd been in days. Jonas released his hold slowly, hovering just in case. Theo stepped forward. He circled once around the dog, examining the frame, the wheels, the angle of the straps. Then he knelt in front of Murphy, silent as ever, and extended a single hand. Fingers curled, then tapped the rug, Once, a beat passed lightly. Theo reached out, placing a small hand on the side of the frame, just resting it there. Just holding. Jonas turned away then, blinking hard, jaw clenched. He couldn't explain why the moment hit him like it did, maybe because it had been years since he'd seen motion paired with purpose in this house, maybe because a boy who hadn't spoken in 729 days had just given a command, without a word, maybe because a crippled dog had obeyed it. But whatever the reason, Jonas knew something sacred had happened here, not loud, not sudden, but real. And for the first time in a very long time, hope had wheels. It was just past noon when Jonas entered the attic. A hush lingered there, different from the quiet of downstairs. This silence felt suspended, like a breath held too long. The floorboards creaked in familiar protest as he ducked beneath the low rafters, brushing cobwebs from an old chest with the side of his boot. Dust motes danced in slants of pale winter light, slicing through the narrow window like faded memories. He wasn't looking for anything in particular, maybe that was the point. Some days, grief didn't come as a storm. It crept in like cold beneath the doorframe, whispering reminders of the things you hadn't touched in years, because touching them meant remembering. The chest groaned open, inside yellowing photo albums, a wool scarf, and beneath them all a small square black box, with a dent in the corner and a cracked plastic lid. Jonas lifted it with both hands. The old CD player. He had almost forgotten they still had it. It still had the sticker Grace had put on it, a faded gold heart, half peeled. The hinge squeaked as he opened the lid. Inside, untouched, was a CD, labeled in her handwriting, Driving Playlist, G&J. She had drawn a tiny music note beside the words. He didn't let himself look at it too long. Downstairs, the fire had burned low in the hearth. Theo was out in the backyard, dragging a branch through the snow like a makeshift plow. Murphy sat by the window, watching the boy through the glass with a quiet that looked almost content. Jonas knelt beside the power strip behind the armchair and plugged the CD player in. The red light flickered, still alive. He pressed play. There was a soft whir, then static, then piano. Gentle, floating, each note, stepping softly into the room, like someone taking off their shoes in a church. Claire de Lune. Jonas sat down without realizing it. The music filled the space, slowly, like light rising through fog. The melody curled beneath door frames, settled into rugs, drifted into spaces that hadn't known sound in months, years maybe. The house didn't reject it, in fact, couldn't name. Jonas watched. The dog blinked once. Then quietly his shoulders began to move. It was subtle, a sway more felt than seen, like a breeze catching the edge of a curtain. His frame creaked slightly on the floor as he tilted forward, then back. One slow rhythm, then another. Not a dance, not quite. More like a memory, trying to stand up inside him. And in that moment, Jonas remembered something too. A Saturday, years ago. The windows down in the truck. Grace's hair blowing across her face as she laughed, telling him this was the kind of song that makes you want to forgive the world. Theo was just a baby then, sleeping in the car seat behind them, his tiny hand clutching the edge of her scarf. The song had played as they wound through the valley, snow melting along the ridges, sun catching in the pines. He had forgotten how much music could carry. Jonas reached for the volume knob and turned it up slightly. The notes swelled, not loud, just fuller, like a heartbeat you'd forgotten was yours. Murphy let out a soft sound, not a bark, not a growl, something like a breath mixed with recognition. Theo had returned without making a sound. Jonas didn't even hear the door open, just sensed the shift in the air. When he turned, the boy was standing near the stairwell, holding a pine cone in one mittened hand. His eyes were fixed on Murphy, then on the CD player, then on Jonas. And something in that gaze was different. Not confusion, but wonder. Theo stepped forward slowly, pine cone still clutched tightly. He came beside Murphy, knelt like he always did, and placed the pine cone down beside the dog. A kind of offering, or maybe just a piece of the outside world brought in to share. Jonas didn't speak. He couldn't have. He just sat there, watching as his son leaned against the dog and listened. Clair de Lune filled the room, climbing gently into the walls. Notes fell like snow, soft, unhurried, each one dissolving into silence before the next arrived. There were no words. There never were. But something moved in the stillness. Theo's cheek rested against Murphy's shoulder. His eyes fluttered closed, and Murphy, in return, shifted just enough to lean into the boy's side. Not a command, not a trick, just being, just present. And for the first time in a very long time, the house did not feel haunted. It felt held by music, by memory, by a dog with battlefield scars and a boy who hadn't spoken in 729 days and didn't need to, not right now, not while the music played. Jonas looked at them, and a tear ran down the edge of his nose. Not grief this time, just grace.
Untouched since the day before. But Jonas had quietly pressed play again before heading to shovel the front path, letting the music pour through the walls like warm tea through porcelain. Theo had not yet emerged. Until now. His footsteps patted against the floor like falling leaves, bare but deliberate. He wore his soft flannel pajamas, the kind his mother used to fold just so, dark green with tiny faded stars at the hem. His hair was tousled from sleep, but his eyes were clear. He didn't speak. He never did. But something in the way he entered the room was different. Murphy was already awake, lying near the fire in the shaft of sun that stretched across the living room floor like a golden river. His frame was mostly still, but the wheels harnessed to his hindquarters gleamed faintly. The canine wheelchair hadn't made him fast, but it made him mobile, and that, somehow, was enough. Theo stood quietly for a long time, just watching. Debussy was playing again, the second track now, arabesque. Its fluttering notes seemed to trip along the wooden floorboards, light as bird wings. The kind of song that makes you feel like something forgotten might return if you just don't move too quickly. Murphy raised his head when he sensed the boy nearby. His ears didn't perk. He was too wise for that. But his eyes followed the small figure as Theo crossed the room. Then something unexpected happened. Theo lifted his hand. He didn't reach out to pet Murphy. He didn't gesture toward the fire or the CD player. Instead, he simply lifted his hand, like he was listening to something only he could hear. Then he stepped, just a small motion, to the left. Murphy blinked. Theo stepped again. It was clumsy at first, hesitant, but his hand remained suspended in the air, fingers slightly curled, as if conducting something that didn't need an orchestra. Then he turned, not fully, just enough to look at Murphy, and softly, barely a sound, tapped the floor with his toe. Murphy responded. It wasn't graceful. His wheels squeaked faintly, and his body shifted, more like a shuffle than a stride. But he moved. Toward the boy, one slow, deliberate lurch. Theo stepped again, this time backward. Murphy followed. A small smile, so faint it might have been imagined, flickered across the boy's mouth. And then, together, they turned. It wasn't a dead crack in the ice, like the first crocus breaking snow in April. It happened. A laugh, small, high-pitched, raw and unpracticed, but real. A sound that hadn't been heard in 729 days. Jonas heard it before he saw it. He was on the porch, dusting snow from his coat, when the sound reached him. A small, startled noise like a bird being freed from a cage. He froze. And then it came again, a laugh. Fragile, disbelieving. Jonas rushed to the window, boots leaving wet tracks across the floor as he tore open the front door and stared inside. There, in the golden spill of light, his son was dancing. Clumsy, joyful, barefoot, and Murphy, that half-frozen dog, scarred and silent, was wheeling around him like some ancient sentinel reborn. Jonas couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. It wasn't the sight of Theo dancing, or even the sight of Murphy moving. It was that sound, that laugh, a note so pure, so unbroken, it undid him. His hand gripped the frame of the door as if anchoring himself. Inside, the music continued. Theo turned again, arms lifted like wings, and then collapsed gently onto the rug beside Murphy, breathless from something deeper than movement. His hands rested on the dog's shoulder, and for the first time in 2 years, 2 whole years, his face held no trace of grief, only warmth. Jonas did not enter the room. He didn't want to break the spell. He just stood in the doorway, coat still unzipped, snowflakes melting in his hair, and watched as his son curled beside a dog who had no past worth naming, not yet, and they both fell into the soft, quiet rhythm of belonging. No words, no permission. Just the unspoken grace of 2 broken creatures finding something close to peace. And in that moment, Jonas felt it. Not hope, not quite, but its echo. Night had wrapped Cedar Hollow in a hush so complete it felt sacred. The house, now dimly lit by the fading embers in the fireplace, no longer resembled a tomb. It hadn't become joyful, not yet, but something had shifted in the air. Less heavy, less haunted. A soft warmth lingered in the silence, as though the walls themselves had exhaled after holding their breath for years. Jonas stood in the kitchen, hands wrapped around a chipped mug of lukewarm tea. He wasn't drinking it, he just needed something to hold. The old floor creaked, and he turned his head slightly, not enough to startle, just enough to witness. Theo had padded quietly into the living room, still in his flannel pajamas. His hair fell messily over his forehead. In his hands, he clutched his favorite fleece blanket, the one with the worn edges that had survived countless washings. A faded rocket ship embroidered near the corner. Murphy beside the German Shepherd. The boy said nothing at first. He just watched the fire, letting its glow reflect in his eyes. The CD player had stopped hours ago. The music was gone. Only the quiet crackle of burning wood remained. And then, gently, deliberately, Theo reached out. He placed his small hand on Murphy's scarred back, where the fur had grown uneven over the surgical line. His fingers rested there, light as snowfall, not petting, just touching, as if grounding himself in something real, something breathing. Jonas didn't move from the kitchen doorway. He wasn't sure why he didn't walk in. Maybe because he knew instinctively that this moment wasn't his. It belonged to Theo, to Murphy, and to something in between them that had no name. Then, like a breeze that barely moved the curtains, Theo leaned in, his mouth lowered toward Murphy's ear, and his lips moved. It wasn't loud enough to be heard. Not even close, but Jonas saw it, not imagined, saw it. A whisper. The boy who had not spoken a word in 2 years, not even in sleep, not even in dreams, was whispering into the thick fur of a broken dog. The fire flickered gently, casting them in golden amber. Murphy didn't flinch or shift. He simply blinked once, slowly, as though receiving something old and sacred, as though understanding it. Theo stayed there for a while, forehead resting against Murphy's shoulder, eyes closed, hand still upon the scar. His chest rose and fell in the rhythm of someone no longer carrying all the weight alone. And Jonas stood still. His throat tightened, not from grief, that was always there, a constant, but from the unfamiliar tremor of hope. He didn't need to hear the words. Whatever Theo said didn't belong to the world of sound or sentence. It belonged to the language of the lost, of the aching, of those who'd found comfort not through logic, but presence. Maybe he told Murphy about the night his mother died. Maybe he told him about the stars, how they looked different now. Maybe he didn't say anything at all, not really. But something had been offered, and something had been received. A small resurrection, quietly exchanged between a child and a creature who knew how to listen without fixing, how to stay without asking. Eventually Theo leaned back and folded his blanket in two, tucking it around Murphy's flank, the way a child might tuck in a sibling, or a soldier might cover a comrade. He didn't kiss the dog, he didn't speak again, he just sat. And in that space, in that stillness, his son had whispered to a broken dog in the dark, and something had returned to them. Not light, not yet, but a flicker, a pulse. Jonas turned off the kitchen light and let the house remain in firelight. He didn't disturb them. He knew enough to let a sacred thing be, and so he watched, hand pressed quietly against the wall for balance, as the boy who hadn't spoken and the dog who wouldn't move simply existed together, side by side, healing in silence, and building, without anyone's permission, a path back to the world. The snow had stopped falling sometime during the night. By morning, Cedar Hollow wore a pale blue silence, as if the world itself had paused to listen. Inside the house the fire had long gone out. A hush settled between the walls, not the aching kind, but a stillness that held something new, like breath before the first note of a song. Jonas stood in the attic. The floor creaked beneath his boots. Dust floated in the beams of light spilling from the narrow window. Boxes were stacked in crooked towers, relics of another life, another man. He hadn't come up here in over a year. He didn't know what had brought him there that morning. Maybe it was the sound of Theo's soft footsteps below. Maybe it was the image of the boy curled beside Murphy, like they'd always belonged to each other. Or maybe it was the scar, that old, uneven scar under the shepherd's ribs that kept pulling at him like an unanswered knock. Whatever it was It brought him to a crate wedged beneath a pile of old blankets and photo frames. Faded letters stenciled in military black read, "Retired K-109, confidential." Jonas knelt. His breath caught in his throat. The box was government-issued, olive metal latches, standard issue for handlers. He hadn't seen one like it since his days working joint ops. During his academy training, back when K-109 units were being cycled out of active deployment with increasing silence, he opened it slowly. The hinges groaned. Inside, files, manila folders yellowed with time, reports, medical scans. A battered collar with a rusted chain looped through it, and underneath all of it, a photo, printed on glossy black and white paper. A dog stood beside a soldier, uniform torn, desert winds in their faces. The dog's eyes were unmistakable, fierce, focused, intelligent, scarred. Jonas held it closer. In small print below the image, Echo 7, Handler, Lieutenant Ramirez, Operation, Sandvale. Recovered assets, 4. Losses, 3. Status, decommissioned. KIA, presumed. He sat down hard on the attic floor. Occupied villages. Located wounded medics, buried under collapsed walls. Protected children from sniper fire. There was a report about a compound raid, one where Echo 7 shielded a young girl with his body. The girl survived. Echo 7 was listed as missing in action 2 days later. Not euthanized, not buried, just disappeared. Jonas exhaled sharply. His fingers trembled as he traced the list of injuries: shrapnel wounds, broken pelvis, abdominal surgery performed in field, survived against all odds. And then, post-trauma refusal to engage, unresponsive, disassociative, discarded. He looked back at the collar. It was smaller than Murphy's current one, scorched in places. The tag had been melted down to illegibility. Echo, he whispered, barely audible. The name tasted metallic in his mouth, like the sound of a bell struck long ago, still echoing down the walls of time. How had he ended up here? In the woods, near Theo? Had someone dumped him? Or had he walked, crawled, survived? Jonas blinked away the sting behind his eyes. His palms gripped the edges of the photo, knuckles white. This wasn't just a dog. This was a soldier, left to die, forgotten by the very system that trained him. He thought of Theo's hands on Murphy's back, thought of the whisper in the firelight, and suddenly the scar meant more than he could bear. Jonas reached the bottom of the box and found a final envelope. No address, no name, just a wax seal cracked with age. He opened it carefully. Inside was a handwritten letter, part of it torn, blood-stained. If you find him, he doesn't need orders, he needs time. He'll choose who to follow. And if he chooses you, don't command. Don't ask. Just trust. There was no signature, no rank, only the initials RL. Jonas sat in that attic for a long time, surrounded by the breath of the past. He thought of all the things this dog had done, all the lives he'd saved, the wounds he'd carried, the silence he'd worn like armor. And now, he had chosen to live beside a boy who hadn't spoken in 2 years. Not by training, by instinct, by something deeper. Jonas rose slowly, holding the photo and collar in his hands. He descended the attic stairs, each step echoing like a heartbeat. He walked into Theo's room. The boy was still asleep, arm draped across Murphy's back. The dog's eyes opened, calm, alert, not surprised. Jonas stood there for a moment. Then, without a word, he bent down and laid the photo gently on the nightstand. Next to it, the collar. A tribute, a recognition, not a secret anymore. Murphy, Echo 7, blinked once and lowered his head back onto the pillow. and somewhere deep tracks. One narrow, one staggered, tracing loops through the snow like the beginnings of a forgotten dance. Theo had insisted on taking Murphy out. Bundled in his too big coat, hood half fallen from his head, the boy trudged beside the German shepherd, one gloved hand always resting on the handle of the wheelchair. Murphy moved slow, wheels crunching against packed snow, his rear legs tucked into the sling Jonas had reinforced with nylon straps. Each motion was careful, quiet. From the window, Jonas watched them, the boy and the dog, together in a stillness that didn't ask for anything. It was one of those moments so ordinary it became sacred, until it wasn't. There was a sound, a shift, a thud, then a metallic clatter. Jonas froze. Outside, Murphy had hit a patch of black ice hidden beneath the snow. His wheels skidded sideways, one caught in a sunken rut. The entire rig twisted, and the shepherd toppled hard onto his side. Theo's cry sliced through the cold like a gunshot. "No!" he shrieked, his voice cracking raw. "No, no, no, don't leave me!" Jonas was already moving, flinging the door open, boots slamming against the porch steps. But Theo had gotten there first. The boy dropped to his knees beside Murphy, sobs erupting from some buried place that hadn't made sound in years. He wrapped both arms around the dog's neck, burying his face into thick fur, fists clutching as if the world would fall apart again if he let go. "Don't leave me," Theo whimpered over and over. "Please don't leave me." Murphy didn't move, not because he was hurt, but because he understood. In that stillness, his body lay quiet, warm breath fogging the boy's cheek, steady and slow. The shepherd blinked once and pressed his nose softly to Theo's temple, holding him in the only way he could. Jonas stopped a few feet away. He couldn't speak, couldn't step in, because what was unfolding wasn't his to fix. This was the boy's wound, not from this fall, but from 2 winters ago, from the accident, from the mother who never came home, from the world that had gone silent and expected him to survive anyway. Now it was unraveling. In a snowy backyard, beside a fallen dog, wrapped in the arms of a child who had finally run out of places to hide. Jonas watched, reached forward, hand trembling, and helped right the wheelchair, steadying it with care, checking the straps. "Hey, buddy," he said gently, voice low. "We've got you." Theo didn't answer, but he didn't pull away. He stayed kneeling, hands still pressed against the shepherd's chest, face wet with tears. Jonas placed his palm lightly on the boy's back, not to lead him, not to lift him, just to be there. Snow continued to fall, not heavy, just a whisper, as if the sky too wanted to speak gently. And there, in the middle of a broken yard, something fragile began to mend. Later, inside, Theo curled beside Murphy on the rug near the fire. Jonas wrapped a blanket around them both and sat nearby. No words, just presence. The boy's breathing evened. His cheek rested against Murphy's shoulder. The dog's tail tapped once. Then again. Jonas leaned his head back and closed his eyes. He thought of the scar beneath Murphy's ribs, of the name Echo 7, of the silent letter he found, the line that said, "Don't command, don't ask, just trust." It made sense now. None of them had needed fixing. Not the boy, not the dog, not even him. They just needed each other. The fire flickered low, casting a soft glow across the wooden floorboards. Outside, the snow had begun to slow. No longer a storm, just a hush. Inside, time had folded in on itself, holding the weight of the moment like cupped hands. Jonas knelt beside the two forms, curled on the rug. Theo, bundled in his coat, still trembling from the outburst. And Murphy, the dog who had never asked to be saved, only accepted it when it came. The shepherd hadn't moved much since the fall, not out of pain, but weariness. The kind that came from carrying too much, for too long. Jonas gently slid his arms beneath the dog, feeling the bulk of him, heavier than he looked, though still far too thin. The old scars beneath Murphy's ribs tensed slightly under his grip, but the dog didn't resist. He simply let himself be lifted. "I've got you," Jonas whispered, more to the air than the animal. His voice cracked at the edges like ice, thinning in spring. Theo sat up watching, his hands clenched into the fabric of his coat, eyes wide and glassy, not just from tears, but from something deeper, fear laced with hope. That dangerous mixture. Jonas turned to him. "Let's bring him closer to the fire, huh?" Theo gave a small nod. The couch had been pushed aside earlier, making room for Murphy's blanket nest near the hearth. Jonas moved slowly, careful not to jostle the harness. He laid the dog down on the thick wool quilt, adjusting, and then softly, so softly Jonas thought he imagined it, came the sound. "Dad?" Jonas froze. His head turned slowly, like a man surfacing from underwater. Theo's face was buried against Murphy's coat, but his voice, hoarse, thin, still new from disuse, trembled out into the room again. "Dad? Is he okay?" Jonas stared at his son. That word, Dad. He hadn't heard it in over 2 years. Not since the day the sirens came, and Grace didn't wake up again. Something in him gave way. He moved closer, sat beside the boy, one hand resting gently on Theo's back. "He is now," Jonas said. The words weren't about Murphy alone. Theo didn't answer. But his body softened, the stiffness in his shoulders easing, the breath in his chest no longer shallow. He leaned in, not just toward Murphy, but toward Jonas, his father, and the house, that quiet house that had carried so much weight, so much silence, seemed to breathe again. The kind of breath a home takes when grief lets go, just a little. When walls soaked in sorrow began to dry at the edges. Murphy stirred. Not much. Just a twitch of the ear, a low thrum in his throat. His eyes opened halfway, and though still clouded with exhaustion, they sought Theo's face. He nudged the boy once, a soft bump of nose to cheek, as if to say, "I heard you too." Theo let out a breath like surrender, not the kind that gives up, the kind that lays something down, a burden, a fear, a secret pain. Jonas stayed beside them for a long time. No words, just one hand on his son's shoulder, the other gently stroking Murphy's side. The room filled with a silence that wasn't empty. It was full of things that didn't need to be spoken, of warmth, of something beginning again. Later, as the fire dimmed and the snow settled into moonlight, Jonas tucked another blanket around Theo and the dog. The boy was half asleep, breathing slow and steady, his fingers still tangled in the shepherd's fur. Jonas stood, watching them both. It wasn't fixed, Not entirely. But it was something. It was a crack in the ice, a hand reaching out in the dark, a boy speaking not because he was ready, but because love pulled the words out of him anyway. He turned off the overhead light. The room sank into soft amber and shadow. As he stepped away, Theo stirred, his voice barely a whisper. Timetable. A single mug steamed near the sink, Jonas's coffee, forgotten while he listened. He was leaning against the door frame that opened into the living room, arms folded, breathing slow. On the braided rug beside the hearth, Murphy dozed, his wheels tilted just enough to keep pressure off the spine that would never quite mend. And there, cross-legged, sockless, hair a soft tumble of straw, sat Theo. The boy was talking, not loud, not steady, but words, real ones, fell from his lips like cautious birds testing air. "Good morning, Murph," he whispered, tracing lazy circles on the dog's shoulder. "Did you sleep? I dreamed about Mom. She was singing, but the notes got stuck in the clouds." A shy laugh, half sound, half breath, fluttered out. "You would have liked the song." Jonas pressed a fist to his sternum as if to keep something from spilling. Yesterday there had been only a syllable, Dad, and before that, nothing. For nearly 2 years. Now the dam was cracking stone by stone, language seeping through. Murphy's tail thumped once. It was answer enough. Theo leaned closer. "Clara says your scar looks better." He pronounced scar carefully, like tasting a new spice. "Says brave dogs get special badges." He tapped the blanket that covered the jagged line beneath Murphy's fur. "Maybe we can make you one." Jonas cleared his throat, stepped into the room. "Badges are earned," he said gently, voice rusty from the restraint of silence. "But I figure he's got a whole pocketful already." Theo lifted his eyes, green flecked with gold, Grace's eyes, and met his father's gaze without flinching. "Dad," he said, the word trembling but sure, "can we make Mom's sandwich? The peanut butter one? The one with the honey swirl?" The request struck like a soft hammer. Grace's peanut butter sandwich. Chunky spread, thin drizzle of clover honey, a dusting of cinnamon, comfort in bread form. She'd made it on rainy afternoons, humming Debussy while Aiden, then barely 5, still answering to Aiden before trauma turned the name into a ghost, balanced on a stool, licking the spoon. Jonas nodded, throat too tight for speech. Theo stood, glanced down to Murphy. "Watch, okay? We'll bring you some." The kitchen smelled of wood smoke and faint citrus cleaner. Jonas fetched the ingredients with reverent slowness. Jar, loaf, honey bear, cinnamon tin, arranging them like relics on a cutting board. Theo climbed onto the same old stool. His toes no longer dangled like a toddler's, but he curled them anyway, a memory in muscle. "Mom always warmed the bread first," Theo said, "just a little." Jonas slid 2 slices into the toasted oil-sheen top. "She said you have to stir the first time or it's all dry later." He dug a wooden spoon deep, working slowly. Jonas sprinkled cinnamon onto a saucer, the scent loosening a knot of memory he hadn't dared touch. Together they spread the thick swirl, Jonas steadying the toast, Theo smoothing edges. Honey dripped in golden threads, cinnamon snowed down, Theo's breathing hitched. "Dad?" "Yeah, bud." "We can eat in the living room with Murph?" Jonas swallowed. Of course. They carried the plate like an offering. Murphy lifted his head, nostrils quivering. Jonas tore a crustless corner, passed it to Theo. The boy knelt, offered the bite to the dog. Murphy accepted with gentle teeth, a single wag. Theo grinned, small, shining, unstoppable. He sat beside Murphy and took his own bite. Peanut butter glued lips slowed speech, but tears slid freely down his cheeks, carving clean tracks through 2 years of quiet dust. Jonas sat across from them, sandwich half forgotten in his hand, and let his own tears fall, for Grace, for lost seasons, for a boy named Aiden who had walked too long in winter and was finally stepping onto thawing earth. Footsteps sounded in the hallway, Clara arriving for her weekly check. She paused at the threshold, eyes widening at the tableau. Father, son, dog, half-eaten sandwiches, tears shining like candlelight. Her smile trembled, hands curling around the medical bag pressed to her chest. Theo noticed her, lifted a honey-sticky hand in greeting. "Hi, Clara." The words were soft but clear. Clara answered with a whisper. "Hi, sweetheart." Murphy sneezed, a comedic puff that broke the solemn hush. Theo laughed, a bright, unashamed peal. Jonas joined, shaky, then stronger, until Clara's chuckle completed the chord. It was no grand resurrection, no trumpets, no sudden sunrise, but it was enough. 3 voices and 1 gentle bark, weaving sound back into walls that once believed they'd never hear it again. Later, as Clara checked Murphy's harness and wiped peanut butter smudges from Theo's chin, Jonas watched the boy chatter, halting and low-voiced, but present, about making a badge from scraps of felt, about teaching Murphy a new dance once the snow melted. Aiden had returned, not in a flood, but in a tender, unstoppable trickle. Each word he offered felt like river water over stones, slow, cleansing, patient. When night came, Jonas found an old notebook and wrote 1 simple line. "Grace, he's speaking your recipe." Outside, the moon laid a silver path across untouched snow, leading, at last, toward spring. Evening dreamt like new ghosts learning how to breathe. Theo knelt on a folded towel, sleeves rolled to his elbows, cheeks flushed from warm mist. He held a sponge in one hand and, with movements slow as lullabies, traced it along Murphy's dark coat. The dog stood in the water willingly, front paws planted, back legs cradled by the sling Jonas had rigged to the tub wall. His ribs rose and fell in calm acceptance, eyes half closed, head bowed as if receiving sacrament. Theo dipped the sponge, squeezed, let the water run in silvery threads over the scar that mapped Murphy's belly. "Easy, buddy," he whispered, voice still tender from its recent return. "Soap stings sometimes." He touched the scar with 2 fingers, feather light, reverent. Then he began humming, not Claire de Lune, but the first half of Twinkle, Twinkle, notes wobbly yet determined. Jonas swallowed past the lump forming. For months he'd bathed Murphy himself, quick and functional. Theo was turning the act into liturgy. A plastic cup clinked against the tap. Theo filled it, poured water gently along Murphy's spine, guiding runoff away from the harness straps. Each pour ended with a soft, "There we go," the phrase sounding like a boy trying on responsibility and finding it fits. When rinsing was done, Theo braced both arms under the shepherd's chest. Too small to lift all the weight, but determined. Jonas stepped in, silent offer implicit. Together they hoisted Murphy, towel-dried him in patient layers, and eased him onto the hallway rug. Waiting there was the blue knit blanket. Grace's blanket. Jonas had discovered it earlier in a cedar trunk, its yarn still carrying the faint scent of lilac detergent. He'd left it folded on the couch, unsure if either of them could bear to look at it yet. Somehow Theo had known what to do. He spread the blanket across the floor like a patch of open sky, helped Murphy settle on it, then tucked corners over the dog's haunches. The knit was loose and soft. Threads caught briefly on the frame of the wheelchair before Theo smoothed them free. "There," he murmured. "Warm." Murphy exhaled, a deep, satisfied chuff, and rested his head on Theo's knee. Jonas stood back, arms crossed over his chest to contain the ache. The hallway light cast a halo around boy and dog,
everything else receding into shadow. Theo rose, wiping damp hands on his jeans, and disappeared toward the den. When he returned, he was carrying a wooden picture frame, one corner chipped, glass smeared with dust. Jonas recognized it instantly. The Whitakers in a sunflower field, Grace laughing as she swung 5-year-old Theo, then still Aiden, above tall blooms. Maya toddled beside them with a fistful of petals. Jonas himself, out of frame, had been complaining about the heat while secretly photographing the scene. Theo set the frame on the floor, leaning it against the wall so Murphy could see, then knelt again. He did full of something older than his 7 years. "Mom always said we're stronger together," he told the dog. "This way she can guard you, too." Murphy blinked, the amber of his gaze catching lamplight, and nudged the photo with his nose, one gentle tap as if to bless the arrangement. Jonas felt his knees threaten to fold. He stepped quietly to the end table where his weathered notebook lay open, pages half filled with scattered thoughts since the night Theo laughed. He uncapped a pen, hands shaking less than before, and wrote, "This is what healing looks like. Soap bubbles on scar tissue, a blue blanket of memory, a photograph reclaiming its voice, and a boy who finally trusts tomorrow enough to tuck it in." Ink bled slightly into paper fibers, anchoring the moment in something permanent. Theo turned, noticed the pen, and offered a small smile, new, tentative, but real. He crawled back to Murphy's side, arranged his own pillow beside the dog's chest, and lay down. His hands slid beneath the blanket until his fingers found the steady thrum of the shepherd's heartbeat. "Sleep now," he whispered. "I'll watch." Jonas closed the notebook, placed it on the mantel. He dimmed the hallway light until only amber coals danced in the grate, then sat on the floor opposite his son, close enough to guard, far enough to honor the cocoon of trust being spun before him. Minutes stretched, logs hissed. Outside, wind coaxed chimes into the faintest tremor. And in that hush, Jonas realized the house had changed key. For 2 winters, the walls had echoed loss. Tonight, they carried a softer resonance, like strings retuned, ready for music again. Murphy's breathing deepened. Theo's eyelids fluttered, war between fatigue and vigil. Just before sleep claimed him, the boy spoke, so soft Jonas almost missed it. "Good night, Mom," he breathed into the blanket's weave. "We're okay." Jonas lowered his head, let gratitude pool behind his eyes, and answered in the only way the room required, silence informed by love. The fire sighed once more, then settled into ember glow. Beneath the watch of a blue knit sky, a soldier dog slept, a child dreamed, and a father, finally, believed. First light touched Cedar Hollow like a secret, turning the snow outside the Whitaker house the color of pearl. Inside, the day began the way it did now, without alarm clocks, without spoken summons, just the soft cadence of a boy's bare feet moving through hushed corridors. Theo padded from his room, still wrapped in the blue knit blanket shepherd's frame. Then he leaned forward until his lips hovered an inch above the fur at Murphy's ear. Words slipped out, barely more than breath. "Mornin', Echo," he murmured, using the secret name Jonas had shared the night before. "Guess what? The snow's crunchy today, perfect for tracks." A pause. "We can race the wind, even if we go slow. Wind doesn't mind." Murphy's ear twitched. One heavy tail thump against the floor. Consent. Promise. Theo continued. Voice small, shaped by rediscovery. Dad says I should practice reading so I can read your files. Then I'll know every brave thing you did. Another tail thump. Softer. But you're brave now, too. Brave for staying. He ended each morning whisper with the same phrase, as if sealing a pact. Stay with me, okay? Murphy breathed out, as if the answer were obvious. Across the room, Jonas stood half-hidden in the kitchen archway, coffee cooling in his hands. He never intruded on the whispers. They belonged to a realm where adults were politely uninvited, an exchange of raw trust between one soul relearning speech and another fluent in silence. Still, the sound, that brushed feather hush of Theo's voice, filled Jonas with something that felt like sunrise in the chest. The front door rattled, then swung wide, letting in a finger of winter air. Clara arrived in her quilted coat, cheeks rosy, a thermos under one arm. She halted when she saw the boy and dog entwined on the rug. Her expression softened into something mothers know. Never mind the doctor's offices, she whispered to Jonas as she eased off her boots. If all healing looked like that, I'd be out of work. Jonas smiled, sliding her thermos onto the counter. He's done it every dawn this week. Won't start the day until he's told the dog a secret. Clara's eyes shone. She stepped into the living room but kept a respectful distance, crouching near the hearth. Theo glanced at her, shyly lifted a hand in greeting, then returned to tracing patterns through the thick fur along Murphy's neck. Tiny loops an inch across, as though braiding comfort itself. "What do you tell him, sweetheart?" Clara asked, voice low. Theo considered, cheeks pinking. "Things," he said, a word that held worlds. He bent again, whispered into fur. Murphy listened, eyelids drooping in serene concentration. Only when the boy finished did the dog shift, stretching his good front legs. Rising into the harness Jonas had propped beside him the night before. Theo guided the frame forward with light taps on the rug. Murphy, now accustomed, rolled two hesitant how to hold them. Jonas's reply was a slow nod. He thought of the scribbled line in his notebook. This is what healing looks like. He considered revising it, adding Clara's observation, but decided the moment itself wrote a better entry than ink ever could. Murphy's wheels clicked gently across hardwood as Theo escorted him to the back door. Jonas helped with the ramp, and together boy and dog ventured into blue morning light. The snow did crunch, sharp little chimes under wheels and boots. Jonas and Clara watched from the doorway while Theo outlined a looping path, his mittened hand pointing out imagined starting lines and finish ribbons. Murphy followed, not with speed, but with a quiet dignity that made progress look like victory. When cold finally painted Theo's nose cherry red, the trio returned inside. Jonas toweled droplets from Murphy's paws. Clara poured cocoa into mismatched mugs. Theo accepted his, but instead of drinking, he set it beside the dog's water bowl, blew across the steam once, and whispered again, "Warm's better shared." Murphy sniffed, nose wrinkling at the sweetness, and Theo giggled, still that fragile, bird-like sound, but stronger than before. Clara leaned against the counter, hands around her own mug. "You feel it?" she asked Jonas softly. He didn't need clarification. He felt the house around him, timbers easing, echoes shifting pitch. A home that once reverberated with loss now resonated with low, steady harmony. The scrape of wheels, the murmur of a boy's growing voice,
the gentle percussion of dog-tail against floor. A score subtle enough that only those who'd known true silence could appreciate its music. Theo finished arranging blankets into a tidy oval, placed the cocoa back in his own hands, and finally sipped. He looked up at his father. "After cocoa, can we read the echo files together? I think he'd like hearing them." Jonas swallowed the unexpected lump. "Yeah, bud, we can read them all." Murphy settled, exhaled, head on pause. His eyes closed, but the line of his jaw angled toward the boy, as if attuned to every syllable the day might bring. Theo stretched out beside him, book already retrieved from the coffee table, finger marking the first page. Before he opened it, he lowered his mouth one last time to the patch of fur behind Murphy's ear. So close Jonas couldn't hear, but he saw the words form. "Still staying." The dog's ear flicked, agreement signed, and in that soft communion, the morning, quiet, stood at the window, watching clouds swallow the horizon. Snow arrived, sideways by 7:30, rattling gutters and seeping beneath the door like cold smoke. Clara had stayed late to rewrap Murphy's bandages. She smirked at the storm, quipping she'd driven in soup thicker than this, before the wind shoved her off balance. Jonas insisted on driving her home. She refused. They compromised. She left, swearing to text when she reached town. Inside, Theo and Murphy sat by the hearth, boy and dog, watching the storm blur the world beyond the window. Firelight cast restless shadows, alive with flicker. "At least it's warm," Jonas said, stoking the logs. Theo didn't respond, gaze calm, transfixed by the storm like it was something alive. Murphy, ears twitching, trusted the walls to stand. At 9:03, the house shuddered, then darkness. The fire sighed, the wind roared, and the lights were gone. Jonas reached for the flashlight, muttering about the breaker, but Theo was already moving. From the linen closet came their emergency tin, tea lights and a stubby vanilla candle, once used for Maya's nightlight. Soon, the room flickered back to life, candlelight catching the silver in Murphy's coat like frost. Jonas tried the fuse box, reset, nothing. Ice had beaten the grid again. Back in the living room, Theo rummaged through the stereo drawer and found Jonas's old phone. One track survived, In Her Eyes, Grace's lullaby. Tinny, fragile, but alive. The melody, piano brushed by violin, lifted something under Jonas's ribs. Theo stood, pajama cuffs brushing his ankles, and gently touched Murphy's wheelchair. "Ready?" A soft tap. Murphy rolled forward. A dance began, slow and unspoken. Theo circled wide. Murphy matched, a pause, a roll. Their shadows, boy and dog, wheels and flicker, waltzed across walls. When the music swelled, Theo stepped in front, placed his hand on Murphy's head, and bowed. The dog dipped his muzzle. Jonas stood frozen, tears brimming, afraid to move, afraid to shatter the moment. Theo whispered something, words only the dog or the storm could hear. Murphy pressed his nose into the boy's chest. The note resolved. Theo laughed, quiet, reverent, a sound shaped from candlelight. Then, softly, "That one was for Mom." House. Amid the storm, Jonas realized they already had. Morning came golden and slow. The house felt still, not empty, but grateful. Jonas stood in the den, a cardboard box at his feet. He hadn't come here in months. He knelt, opened it. On top, a photo beneath tissue. Grace in a sunflower field, lifting Theo midair. Maya beside her, clutching flowers. Joy frozen in sunlight. His hand hovered, a sharp pang, but it didn't overwhelm. Not this time. He lifted the photo and placed it on the long, empty mantel. The blank spot had accused him for years. Today it felt ready. Footsteps. Theo in the doorway, hair tousled, Murphy at his side. The boy saw the picture, eyes widening. "Mom," he whispered, no fear, just reverence. Jonas nodded. "Yeah, that's Mom and Maya." "The sunflowers," Theo breathed. "I ran through them. Maya chased butterflies." She caught one, Jonas smiled. It landed on her nose. Theo smiled faintly, fingers in Murphy's fur. Jonas knelt beside him. "I thought putting that photo up would hurt too much," he said. "But maybe grief doesn't leave. Maybe we grow around it." Theo leaned in. Murphy pressed close. "You know," Jonas added, "Mom used to say goodnight twice. Once for dreams, once for courage." "Then maybe," Theo said, voice steady, "we say good morning the same way." He turned to the photo. "Good morning, Mom." Twice. Jonas exhaled. Something loosened. They stayed that way, father, son, and dog, under Grace's smile, quiet humming in the walls. Later, Theo whispered into Murphy's fur. The shepherd listened, ears cocked as if keeping it safe. Jonas found his notebook, wrote carefully, "We don't heal by forgetting. We heal by remembering gently, until the memories stop breaking us." Outside, ice shimmered. The fire was cold, but the house glowed. Grace stood watch. "Dad," Theo asked, "can we plant sunflowers this spring?" Jonas nodded, soft smile forming. Yeah, she'd like that. It was one of those afternoons when the sky forgets how to feel. No snow, no sun, just light sifting through melting snow. Water dripped from the eaves. The world paused. Theo sat by the window, Murphy's head in his lap. The boy traced his ear gently. "To be a hero anymore," he said. "You don't have to run, or be strong when it hurts, or remember the things that made you afraid to sleep." Murphy blinked. Stillness settled between them. "You're safe now," Theo said, "with me." He leaned in, forehead to muzzle. "Just stay." Murphy nudged closer. Not a bark, not a vow. Just presence. Steady, warm, alive. Theo opened his eyes. No cameras, no father watching, just them. Two beings choosing each other. "I'll stay too," Theo whispered. "Even when I forget how to smile, I won't leave you." Murphy's tail brushed the floor, soft agreement. The boy smiled, small, true, the kind that slips out when your heart remembers how. Upstairs, footsteps, laundry. The world resumed. Murphy stirred, but Theo touched his shoulder. "No need. We're good right here." The dog settled again. Theo pulled the blue blanket across his back, careful, like tending something sacred. When Jonas returned, boots wet, groceries in hand, he paused in the doorway. His son and the dog curled together, not asleep, not waiting, just being. Jonas didn't speak, didn't move, just watched. He pulled his notebook from his coat and wrote, "Some souls don't need to be rescued, just reminded they're allowed to rest." Behind the glass, daylight dimmed into soft gray. Two survivors stayed just where they were. Not hoping, not healing, just living. And that, Jonas knew, was enough. The coffee in Jonas's hand was still warm, but he hadn't touched it in 10 minutes. He stood quietly at the edge of the town meeting room, eyes on the cluttered bulletin board, missing dog flyers, church yoga announcements, and a smiling boy holding a beagle beneath the word, "Still missing." But his mind was elsewhere. Across the room, Dr. Lisa Rowan laid down a folder thick with proposals, testimonies, and photos of working dogs, some with grins, some with ghosts behind their eyes. A few weeks earlier, Jonas had asked her a question, not a plan. "Do you think Murphy could help more than just us?" From that seed, something had grown. It had a name now, the Murphy Project. The idea was simple in theory: pair retired or injured canines with children recovering from trauma. No official training, no certifications, just presence. Just survivors meeting survivors, and letting something ancient pass between them. Clara walked in, arms full of handmade pamphlets. Her nod wasn't for luck. It said, "I believe in this." Theo hadn't come. Jonas didn't ask him to. He just left a blue blanket folded in Theo's room, the one and a chance. He placed a photo on the table, Theo and Murphy, curled together on the floor. "This is what healing can look like." Dr. Rowan stood beside him. "These dogs, Echo 7s like Murphy, come home with scars and silence. Most are euthanized within months." Clara stepped forward. "And these kids carry their own wounds, the kind you don't always see, the kind they carry alone." "We're not trying to fix everything," Jonas added. "Just give them someone who gets it, someone who made it through the fire and lived." Mrs. Gates asked the obvious, "Is this therapy? Will it need licensing?" Dr. Rowan smiled. "Not clinical, not structured, just presence. All dogs will be medically cleared. We're starting on my property. No risk to the public." Sheriff Donaldson raised an eyebrow. "You want to house these dogs yourselves?" "We already are," Jonas said. He opened his worn notebook and read from a page. "Some souls don't need to be rescued, just reminded they're allowed to rest." Clara blinked hard. Even Marvin Price shifted in his seat. "We're not asking you to sign anything," Dr. Rowan added. "Just visit. See what happens when a child touches a scar and realizes they're not broken, just healing." "It's idealistic," someone muttered. "So is teaching a child to read," Jonas said evenly. "This is no different." The sheriff gave a slow nod. "I'll stop by next week." "Bring your granddaughter," Jonas replied. "Murphy would like her." After the meeting, people lingered. A young teacher asked if volunteers were needed. Marvin said nothing, but he took a folder. Outside, the cold met them like breath on a cheek, sharp, honest. Liza asked, "You think they'll say yes?" "They already did," Jonas murmured. "They just don't know it yet." Across the snowy lot, Murphy's ears peeked above the truck's dash, watching, always watching. Behind him, Theo curled in his blanket, sketching. The town wasn't fixed. The wounds weren't gone. But something had shifted. A dog once trained to take down threats now existed simply to be held. And maybe that was a new kind of mission. One worth everything. The barn smelled of hay and liniment. Afternoon light striped the floor with gold. Snow melted slowly outside. Inside, Theo knelt beside Jasper, a German shepherd with one eye and 3 legs. The dog had just arrived. No one knew his exact age, only that his scars ran deep. Murphy lay nearby, still present. On a bench near the door sat Ivy, a small girl in a pink parka. Her mother had died weeks ago. Since then, Ivy hadn't spoken, not a word, not a hum. She clutched a stuffed otter like a lifeline. Theo didn't try to talk. He knew better now. Healing didn't start with asking. It started with staying. He clipped Jasper's harness. "Let's try again," he whispered. "Legs to be strong." Clara watched from the far end of the barn. Liza worked outside, prepping ramps. Ivy's eyes flicked to Theo, to Jasper. Then, without prompting, Jasper stopped in front of Ivy, sat, and laid his head gently on her boot. Ivy froze. Murphy lifted his head just once, as if to say, "Yes, that one." Ivy didn't speak, but slowly her hand lifted and rested on Jasper's ear. Just sat there, unsure, but present. Clara moved to step forward. Jonas stopped her. "Let them be," he whispered. Then Ivy's lips moved. Not a word, not yet. Just something between breath and memory. Jasper didn't move. Theo knelt beside them. "That's the trick," he murmured. "You don't have to fix them. Just stay long enough for them to remember they're not broken." Then Ivy whispered, "His ear is warm." The barn froze, not from fear, from reverence. Murphy's tail tapped, once, then again. Clara turned away, shoulders shaking in joy. Jonas rubbed his face with both hands. Liza paused mid-step, hearing the whisper echo under the rafters. Ivy didn't speak again that day, but she stayed with Jasper until dusk, tucking her otter beneath his paw before leaving. A gift, not permission. A promise. That night, Jonas wrote, "Progress is not a speech. Sometimes it's a child's hand on the neck of a dog too tired to chase anymore." The wind had softened. The house smelled of toast and old coffee. Clara hummed as she folded napkins into triangles, something Grace used to do. Jonas stood at the counter, clipboard in hand. Plans, sketches, support letters, vet clearances. A program that once didn't exist and now, somehow, did. But it needed a name. In the living room, Theo sat with Murphy, a blank page in front of him. They'd been sitting like that for an hour, breathing in rhythm. No words needed. Jonas crouched beside them. "We need a name," he said gently. Liza had ideas. Clara, too. But it's yours as much as anyone's. Theo didn't speak. He picked up the pencil. His strokes were slow, intentional, not rushed. He stood and handed the paper to his father. Second chances, living room. Theo sketched again. A dog with 3 legs and a cape. Above it, "Murphy isn't broken." And underneath, still forming in smaller letters, "He just took a different road home." Winter left Cedar Hollow the way a widow leaves a gravesite, slowly, with reverence. Snow retreated from rooftops like a pulled-back blanket. Icicles broke loose with soft clinks, and the town yawned awake. Jonas stood before the mirror in his dress blues, fastening the silver clasp. The uniform still held the weight of funerals past, but today felt different. Not free of grief, but gentled by something deeper. Behind him, Theo sat cross-legged on the bed. "You look like her," he said. Jonas turned. "Who?" "When she stood at the stairs before concerts, in her white coat." Jonas swallowed. "Yeah, she always dressed for the music." Theo returned to fastening Murphy's new bandana, deep blue with silver notes. Clara had stitched the words, Echo 7, still serving. Outside, townsfolk filled the sidewalks. Hot cider steamed from paper cups. Daffodils bordered the square. After 2 quiet years, Cedar Hollow breathed together again. A stage stood simply dressed. Grace's old choir students waited with sheet music in hand. Jonas, Theo, and Murphy arrived as the mayor stepped forward. "This next piece," the mayor said, "was once the heart of our spring gathering. Today we remember Grace Hart." A hush fell. Strings began Clair de Lune. Not piano this time, but a quartet, melody, floating like soft light. Theo's hand stayed in his father's. Murphy leaned into him. Jonas closed his eyes and let it come. Grace spinning in socks across hardwood floors, singing under her breath, placing her hand over his heart and whispering, "It's okay to carry sadness. Just don't let it steal your song." When he opened his eyes, Theo was swaying. Murphy's tail tapped once, and a child near the front held a stuffed shepherd with a bandaged leg. The song faded. No applause followed, only silence, part of the music itself. The mayor stepped up again. "We dedicate this festival to those who stayed, and those who helped us remember how." Jonas nodded in thanks, not for himself but for the quiet understanding. Theo stepped forward and placed a single white tulip at the stage's foot. One by one, others followed. Children, elders, farmers with dirt under their nails. Flowers laid not in mourning, but in honoring. As Jonas, Theo, and Murphy turned to leave, Jonas asked, "You okay?" Theo looked up. She heard it. Jonas blinked. "What?" "The music," Theo said. "I think she heard it." Jonas looked toward the blue breaking through clouds, at daffodils swaying, at a town singing again. "I think she did too." Square. Theo wore a simple white shirt, sleeves rolled. Around his neck, Grace's silver pendant. Murphy's bandana, now faded at the edges, caught the breeze. There was no music, no beat, just motion. Theo didn't dance with steps. He danced in arcs, guiding Murphy's wheelchair across the stage in soft loops, pausing, turning, circling again. Each pass was unchoreographed but deliberate. Like waves folding in, Murphy followed, trusting, not moving on his own since the accident, but now dancing, not carried, but partnered. And the town saw it, not the novelty, the vow. The boy who hadn't spoken in months, the dog labeled damaged. Together they wove something holy, a return, a rhythm. Jonas stood beside Clara and Dr. Rowan. He didn't breathe from reverence, not fear. Halfway through, Theo stopped and pressed his forehead to Murphy's, still as a prayer. Murphy closed his eyes. Theo pulled back, eyes shimmering, and turned the chair in one last circle, then stopped and bowed. Not to the crowd, but to the space, to memory, to Murphy. Silence held. Then, softly, clapping. A child, then another, until the square echoed not with celebration, but with recognition. Clara wiped her cheek. Jonas let his tears fall. "Did you see that?" she whispered. Jonas nodded. "That wasn't a performance," she said. That was a promise. Murphy turned at her voice. His eyes met Jonas's, and for a second, Echo 7 looked out, brave, steady, unshaken. He served differently now, with presence, with stillness. Theo wheeled him off stage. The crowd parted naturally. Children stepped back with awe. Parents with hands on hearts. "Did we do okay?" Theo asked softly. Jonas knelt, placed his hand on Murphy's back and said, "You danced him home." Theo's lip trembled, but he didn't cry. Murphy licked his hand and rested his chin in the boy's lap. In the hush, two survivors stayed exactly where they were, together, alive. The sun dipped low, casting Cedar Hollow in soft amber. Jonas stood at the gazebo's edge, one hand on the rail, the other against the paper in his pocket. Not for notes, but to anchor him. The energy around him lingered. Families sipped cider, children laughed. But something deeper pulsed beneath it all. What now? Jonas stepped to the mic. Behind him, Murphy rested beneath the festival banner. Theo sat beside him, pie forgotten on his plate. Clara stood with a girl who now named birds aloud. The same girl who hadn't spoken until last month. Said, "Comes in mornings, in a child saying your name, in a dog too old to run, just staying." He looked at Murphy. The dog blinked. "That's why I'm here. To tell you about something we're starting, the Murphy Project." No gasps, just attention. "It started as a notebook," he explained. "A question. What if the dogs who once saved us could be saved too? What if, instead of being discarded, they were reassigned?" A beat. Then, "We're launching a sanctuary, a second chance, for dogs with injuries, for kids with invisible wounds, right here in Cedar Hollow." He turned to Theo. "And we're naming it what he called it. Second Chances for Heroes." A woman covered her mouth. An old man began to clap, slow, steady, like something long frozen had cracked open. Jonas stepped forward. "Some dogs are born with a job. Others find it." His voice wavered. "But the ones who heal, the ones who stay, they're not born or found." He looked at Murphy again. "They're sent." A hush, then tears, then applause. Not thunderous, but whole. Murphy didn't bark. But he lifted his head, rested it on Theo's leg, an old soldier answering roll call. Theo reached down, stroked behind his ear. Tears slid down his cheeks. Jonas stepped back. Clara moved beside him. "You did it," she whispered. "No," Jonas said, eyes still on his son. "They did." And in the crowd, people didn't see a policy or a plan. They saw a boy who once vanished, smiling, a dog once cast aside, becoming a bridge. And in the ache and hope of it all, they saw themselves. And the promise that something still grows after grief. Something named Murphy. Something that stayed. The house had always made sounds, creaks in the floor like hesitant footsteps, a whistle through window seams when the wind curled close. The refrigerator hummed like it was trying to fill the silence. But ever since Grace left, the defining sound wasn't noise at all. It was the echo of things unsaid, of laughter remembered only by walls, of a child who stopped speaking, of a man who stopped hanging pictures. Now, Jonas stood in the hallway, hands dusty with plaster. He'd just finished patching the wall above the fireplace, where Grace's photo had returned weeks ago. No longer tucked away in a drawer. She was home again, watching over the heart of the house. Today, he held another frame, a photo Clara had taken, without him knowing, from the spring festival. Theo pushing Murphy mid-dance, the boy's face tilted to the sun, hand on the harness, The other stretched like he was keeping time with music no one else could hear. Together, they looked like a hymn. Jonas measured the space beside the dog who refused to let him fall. For the first time in years, the house didn't echo. It sang. In the living room, light filtered through the sheer curtains Theo had chosen. "They look like clouds," he'd whispered. "Mom would have liked them." Jonas had just nodded then. Now he saw what the boy meant. Theo sat on the rug beside Murphy, reading aloud from a book about space. Not because Murphy cared about planets, but because Theo knew dogs don't need to understand words to feel wonder. Murphy blinked slowly. Ears twitched. Jonas didn't interrupt. He just sat on the edge of the couch, eyes scanning the room, like he was seeing it rebuilt in real time. A vase of dandelions on the table, a refilled bookshelf, muddy shoes by the door. A leash beside them, still used, still trusted. He pulled a notebook from the drawer, flipped to a blank page, then paused, listening. Not for danger, not for grief, but for stillness. Theo looked up, smiled, not seeking approval, just saying, "I see you." "You okay, Dad?" he asked. Jonas nodded, then glanced toward the fireplace. "I think we all are," he said softly. "Finally." Murphy gave a soft grunt. Theo giggled. "He thinks so too." They didn't say more. The silence didn't hurt anymore. It didn't bounce around like a ghost. Now it held them. Every floorboard, every flicker of lamp, whispered the same thing. "We're still here." Jonas stood, walked to the mantel, looked at the photos, Grace and her son. Laughter and light. Love remembered. Love reborn. "This," he whispered to the walls, "this is what a place to belong feels like." And for the first time, the house didn't just hold memories, it made them. Night came gently, no crashing wind, just a soft quilt folded over Cedar Hollow, stitched with stars. Lamps glowed low in the living room, reverent. Murphy lay on his blanket by the hearth, the blue knit one frayed at the edges with a paw-print patch Theo had sewn himself. His breathing was slow, steady, a lullaby in fur. Theo knelt beside him. No books, no games, just hush, the kind that feels like a chapel. Jonas stood in the doorway, watching, not intervening. He had learned the difference between protection and presence. Theo stroked Murphy's fur, fingers tracing the scar above his shoulder. Then Jonas knelt beside him, resting a hand on the boy's back. "You said it," he murmured. "I didn't think I could," Theo whispered, "but I wanted him to know." Jonas looked at Murphy, one ear still tilted toward Theo, still listening. "He knows," Jonas said gently. "He always has." They stayed there, father, son, and the dog, who never needed words to love them. The fire crackled low. Wind tapped at the window, like memory asking to come in. Jonas thought of the nights before, the tightness, the grief. But this night felt different. This night was full, because someone had spoken, because someone had been heard. Theo looked at the photo on the mantel, him and Murphy, mid-dance. His gaze lingered, then dropped. He rested his cheek on Murphy's shoulder. Is he gonna be okay? The question wasn't fear, it was gentleness. Jonas glanced at the dog's breath. Still steady, still here. He nodded. He already is. Theo nodded too. And something passed between them, not just about Murphy, but about everything. Loss, life, and the long road back home. Jonas kissed the top of Theo's head and stepped to the light switch. He turned it off. The fire carried the rest. When he glanced back, he saw them. The boy, the dog, the quiet. But this time, it wasn't empty. It was whole. The house was still, but not the stillness that haunts. The kind that holds. Warmth in breath. Wholeness in silence. Grief reshaped by love. The fire burned low, amber light painting soft halos on the walls. Logs no longer crackled. They whispered, like old friends settling into sleep. Jonas stood, notebook in hand, pen above a blank page. Across the room, Theo had fallen asleep on the rug, arm draped over Murphy's ribs. The dog breathed in rhythm, not asleep, but not apart. Jonas didn't know what moved his hand. Maybe the hush, maybe the firelight, maybe the way Murphy's tail gave one slow thump when Theo exhaled. But the pen moved. The snow didn't bury us. It waited for us to remember how to breathe. He didn't revise, didn't reread. The sentence didn't need fixing. Jonas closed the notebook and walked toward the window. Outside, frost began to retreat. Not in waves, in tiny acts of surrender, a patch of grass here, a drip from the eave there. The snow still blanketed the garden beds, the porch steps, but near the stone path, where wind touched most, a crocus had. He placed it beside the newer frame on the mantel, the one of Theo dancing with Murphy at the festival, arms outstretched, eyes closed, the whole town wrapped in hush behind them. Two images, years apart, but side by side now, and in the middle, not space, but memory. He looked back to the rug. Theo had nestled closer to Murphy now, his forehead resting against the dog's shoulder. He whispered something, too soft to catch, but whatever it was, Murphy responded with a breath that shivered down his flank like a lullaby. It struck Jonas then. There were languages that didn't need words, that weren't taught in schools, that no war could teach and no loss could erase. This was one of them. Boy and dog. Survivor and survivor. One who had seen fire, one who had walked through it, both of them still standing. Jonas knelt beside them, placed a hand on Murphy's side, then one on Theo's shoulder. The boy didn't wake, but his hand shifted, unconsciously covering Jonas's knuckles, and in that small, accidental gesture, the three of them, father, son, dog, formed a circle. Imperfect, healing. Jonas didn't move, didn't need to. Outside, a single gust of wind knocked snow from the cedar branches, revealing the green beneath. The air still held winter's edge, but it no longer bit. It only lingered, as if saying goodbye. And in the silence of that night, spring didn't arrive with fanfare, it arrived with hope. Sometimes, healing doesn't come with grand gestures. It arrives on quiet pause, in gentle nudges, and the kind of eyes that seem to understand even what we can't say out loud. German shepherds, like Murphy, remind us that loyalty isn't loud, it's steadfast, that love doesn't need words, just presence. And that in the hardest seasons, sometimes the ones who stay by our side aren't people, but hearts wrapped in fur. If this story stirred something in you, maybe a memory, or just a longing to be closer to your own dog, I'd like to gently share something that helped me deepen that bond. It's not a product or a pitch, just a resource I came across and thought, this feels right. You can take a look if it speaks to you, or not. Either way, thank you truly for giving this story your time, your heart, and your listening. Because sometimes, the world doesn't need more noise. It just needs more of us, staying.